I'm getting an echo. Is anybody else getting an echo? Linda, can you mute yourself? Wait, I might be able to do it. All right, how about now? Is that better? Is the echo gone? All right, I'm gonna change the view back. Okay. Okay, so this is very exciting because the Haftarah this week is did I just lose all of you? Are you here? No. Okay. All right. The Haftarah this week is a narrative portion that comes from the book that we call in Hebrew Malachim Bet, which is, you may know as Second Kings. Okay. So what I want to do is four things. I want to summarize very quickly the Parsha because there's a lot of connections this week between the Parsha and the Haftarah, a lot. So I'm going to just remind you what's in this week's Parsha. And then we're going to summarize the Haftarah, and we're going to talk about what are the connections. There are linguistic connections, and there are thematic connections. We're going to talk about that as well. And then I'm going to talk about some universal lessons that we can extract from this teaching. And also, if we have time, I prepared some mystical insights, some Kabbalistic insights to this story. But first, I want to point out that there are two Torah portions with very similar names. This week's Torah portion is called Vayeira, which is in the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapters 18 to 22. And it means literally, and he appeared. There's also in the book of Exodus, in the book of Shemot, around chapter 6 to 9, there's a Torah portion called Vayeira. So this is Vayeira, and the other one is Vayeira. So they sound very similar. This week we're going to be talking about Vayeira, which, by the way, is my grandson's bar mitzvah parsha, although he's going to turn 8 on Monday. So he's a few years away from his bar mitzvah. But let me just do a very brief summary. There's a lot that happens in the Parsha. So because we're going to be talking about the parallels between the Torah portion and the Haftarah, I just want to review the main episodes of this Parsha so that they're fresh in your mind, okay? So one is that God appears to Abraham as he's sitting at the entrance to his tent. And there is the announcement of the forthcoming birth of Yitzchak, of Isaac. There's these three visitors who are actually angels who inform Abraham and Sarah that they're going to have a son within the year. And Sarah responds to that news with disbelief. She finds it hard to believe. Then Abraham intercedes for Sodom. So God shares his plan to destroy the wicked cities of what you probably call Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Amara. And Abraham pleads with God to spare the cities if a certain number of righteous people can be found there. They are not able to be found there. And so God does destroy these two cities. But Lot, who is the nephew of Abraham, and his family are saved by angels while the city is destroyed. This is the famous story of Lot's wife. Like, they are told, don't look back. Lot's wife looks back and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Then comes the birth of Yitzchak, the birth of Isaac, born to Abraham and Sarah, the way that the angels promised. Hagar and Ishmael, Hagar, the handmaid of Sarah, who becomes the first wife of Abraham, the second wife of Abraham, and her first son, Ishmael are sent away. And then at the end of this parsha is the binding of Isaac, what we call in Hebrew the Akedah, which is a major test of faith where God commands Abraham to sacrifice Yitzhak, Isaac, on Mount Moriah, which is where the temple is. And Abraham prepares to obey him, but an angel stops him at the last minute and stays his hand, and they offer a ram instead. I'm only going through all that so that you have it in your mind, because I'm going to connect it later to some things that happen in the Haftarah. So here's the Haftarah, okay? It's in Malachim Bet, 2 Kings, chapter 4, verses 1 through 37. It's not the entirety of chapter 4, but the chapter records a series of miracles that are performed by the prophet Elisha. We call him Elisha Hanavi. He is a disciple and a successor to the prophet Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi. And this chapter emphasizes the compassion of God in a number of ways, the power of faith, the role the prophet has as a conduit for bringing blessing into the world. And the part that becomes the Haftarah are two stories. And I'm guessing that you probably have studied these at some point in your life, but I'm going to review these stories so that they are top of mind again, in a little bit more detail than I did the Torah portion, in order that that you'll be able to see the connections that I'm going to make. So the first story is told in verses 1 through 7. So there's this destitute widow. She's identified by our rabbis as the wife of the prophet Obadiah. Maybe you call him Obadiah, I think. And Obadiah has passed away. Well, he was killed, actually. And the wife is destitute, and she appeals to Elisha because her creditor, who is the crown prince, who later becomes the king, threatens to take her sons away as slaves. Where does the story take place? It takes place in the northern kingdom of Israel during the mid 9th century BCE. So approximately 3,000 years ago. Okay, this is of um, before the time before the time of the second temple, before the time of the destruction of the first temple. Why does she have a creditor? Why is there someone coming after her? Here's the story. Her husband, the king and queen at the time of the northern kingdom, are the very wicked Achav and Izebel, Ahab and Jezebel. Okay. They, Jezebel in particular, is an idolater. She worships Baal, and she wants to kill all of the righteous prophets of God. The husband of our widow hides away 100 prophets from the rage of Jezebel, by hiding them in a cave and providing for them food and drink, whatever they need. And he uses up all his money to do that. And when his money runs out, he borrows money to continue to buy food for them. And who does he borrow from? He borrows from Jehoram, who is one of the sons of Achav, the king Ahab, and Jezebel. Okay, and he does eventually become king himself after his father dies and after his brother leaves the throne. Okay, so Jehoram demands interest from Obadiah, which is, by the way, against Torah law in itself. But Obadiah agreed because he was desperate to save these 100 prophets from the queen, who was killing all of the prophets in the north of Israel this time. So he dies penniless. And Jehoram comes to his widow. This is the widow in this part of the story, and says he's going to take her sons in payment for the debt that if she can't pay what her husband borrowed. And her main concern, she doesn't have the money, obviously, but her main concern is that her sons are going to grow up in idolatry, because Jehoram was marginally better than his evil parents, Achab and Ahab and Jezebel, but he was not loyal to Hashem, and he was frequently butting heads in conflict with the main prophet of the time, who was Elisha. So the widow turns to Elisha for help, and Elisha instructs her to collect as many empty vessels as possible, and to pour what she has in her house is a very small quantity of oil. And he tells her, pour from there into the vessels that you borrowed from your neighbors. And miraculously, the oil continues to flow until every one of the vessels that she borrowed is full. And she sells that oil, pays off her debt, and she lives on the remainder. That's the basic story. There's when we were living in America, I had this was a custom. A lot of Jewish art portrays men, Jewish men. And I really was looking for pieces that portrayed women, either lighting candles, baking challah, praying, whatever. So I don't have it anymore, but I will send you a link after class to this picture. There's a Chabad artist, I think he passed away, but he's contemporary times, named Mikhail Muchnik. And he painted this scene under the title Elisha's Blessing. The scene depicts the widow with vessels all around her, and she's pouring oil into it. And one of the teachings of this story is that um, how the widow had faith in God's provision, but also faith in the prophet, that she went to him and said, "You have to help me." And actually, on this story, the Talmud talks about how a small act of faith can invite divine abundance. We're going to talk about this a lot more. But it also underscores that there is in the Torah world a particular mitzvah of supporting widows and orphans. The assumption being that they in the time when women didn't have economic resources of their own, orphans don't have economic resources of their own, there's a particular sensitivity to meeting their needs. Okay, that's the first story in the Haftarah. The second story is also concerns Elisha, but it's a totally different woman that he's interacting with. Okay, so the second tale is the one I think that's more, we'll see more connections in this story that I'm about to tell over than the first one, but the first one comes into play a little bit. So in summary, there's a wealthy woman. She lives in a town called Shunem, and she regularly hosts Elisha. And because she does that and she's wealthy, she builds a special little room for him so that when he's visiting, he can have his privacy. Okay. And sort of like an Airbnb attached to her house. And Alicia's very moved by her kindness to him, not just that she's giving him hospitality, but that she built a special room for him that he could have privacy and he can stay whenever he's traveling around. And he's very moved by this kindness of hers. So he promises her that she's going to bear a son, despite the fact that she is past childbearing years. I'll go into the story in more detail, but very shortly, um, the child she does have a child. He is born, and when he is young, I get the impression he's maybe like under 10, 7, 8, 9, 10, something like that. He dies suddenly, and the woman travels back to Elisha and demands that he come back and revive her child. Okay, now let's look at the story in a little bit more depth. What the heck is Elisha doing in Shunem? Shunem was a city in the Jezreel Valley, so it's in the lower Galil, it's in the north of Israel. And there, just like the prophet Shmuel, the prophet Samuel, Elisha, who lived during the time the first temple was standing, would travel around Israel teaching people, encouraging them to come closer to God and so forth. And so the woman with whom Elisha would stay whenever he was in her neighborhood is described in the Hebrew as an Isha Gedolah. Literally, that means a large woman, but it's understood to mean that she was prominent or that she was great. Some say it means she was wealthy. And the Zohar teaches us that she was the greatest woman of her time. And they compare her, there is a source that compares her in her connection to God to the matriarch Sarah and Rivka, Sarah and Rebecca. Okay, so she's a pretty important character. And some people say that there's another time that this Shunam comes up. There's a woman named Avishag who was also from Shunem, who was the young maiden who warmed the bed of King David in his last years. We find this story in Melachim Aleph in First Kings, chapter 1, verse 3. Okay, so some people say that they were sisters. They were both from this city of Shunem. Some people say that this woman, this great woman's husband, was the prophet Edo. So there's a lot of prophecy going on. Edo, the prophet Edo, by the way, is mentioned in the book of Chronicles, but not in the rest of Tanakh. He does not, there's no book called the book of Edo. Anyway, it was her practice to be hospitable. And some people say that she started hosting Elisha before she knew who he was. He was just a traveler in her town. But then after he had been with her for a while and she observed the fineness of his character, she asked her husband to build a special room so he would have this privacy whenever he stayed with them. And Elisha wants to do something for her. So Elisha has this servant named Gehazi, and he asks Gehazi to go get this Shunammite woman, their hostess, so that he can give her a blessing. And he asks her Is there something I can do for you? Do you have, maybe you have some government problem, some way I can intervene with the king or with the head of the army on your behalf? And she says, no, no, the literal quote from the text itself says, I dwell among my people. And the implication of that is that she's content with her life. She has no need for any special protection, what we call in Israel protexia. And also, it is considered a credit to her that she kept her distance from the government, where there's a lot of um, where there's a lot of immorality and not good things going on. Okay, so Alicia says, "What can I do to pay you back for your kindness?" And she basically says, "I don't need anything." But the servant, Gehazi, noticed that there's no child in the household, even though she and her husband were too old to have a child at that point. And so Elisha says to her, this is in chapter 4, verse 16, at this season next year, you will be embracing a son. So he gives her a promise that she's going to have a son, which did indeed happen, as you know. And some people say that her son was actually the prophet Habakkuk. I don't know what you call him, but Habakkuk does in fact have a short book in Tanakh about his prophecies. The story goes on that the boy, when he's young, he's out in the fields working with his father, and he complains of a headache. And his father has him brought back into the house where he sits on his mother's lap. She holds him for a couple of hours, and he basically dies. And what does she do? She takes the dead child, lays him on the bed that she has um, made for Elisha. He wasn't there at the time. And she says a prayer over him. And then she saddles up a donkey and goes off to find Elisha, who was in Mount Carmel. And when she reaches Elisha, she demands that he come to revive her child. She reminds him that in their conversation where he said, I'm going to bring you a child, she said, like, basically, don't play with me. Don't give me a baby who's not going to live, because that would be more painful than not having a child at all. And if you know, don't give me a child that's fated to die young. Now you've given me this child, he's died young. And Elisha understands the gravity of the situation. And so he sends his servant Gehazi to revive, tells him what to do, how to revive the child. Gehazi fails in his mission. And the Shunammite woman says, you must come. It has to be you. You have to come and save my child. And so Elisha goes back to the house in Shunem, and he does, in fact, through intensive prayer and other interventions, he revives the child. Um, there's a story in Malachim Aleph in 1 Kings chapter 17 where Elisha's mentor, Eliyahu, also revived a child. That story is in 1 Kings chapter 17. Okay. And so once the child is revived, the Shunammite woman, whose name we do not know, unfortunately, she's called back to pick up her son, who's been returned to the land of the living. And she prostrates herself at the feet of Elisha, and then she leaves with her child. Okay. That's the end of the Haftarah, the narrative of the Haftarah. And there's a few things worth mentioning. First of all, you can already see that this woman, this Isha Gedolah, this woman of Shunam, is a woman of agency. She's the one who has the idea to build this Airbnb room for Elisha. She tells Elisha, don't give me a son if he's going to die young. And when he dies young, first she's seen praying, and then she saddles up her donkey and she travels to Mount Carmel to insist that Elisha revive her child. She does not, she tells her husband that she's going, but she doesn't consult with him, and she doesn't send him. She merely tells him, I'm going, and she's not shy about demanding that Elisha come and revive her son. And then when Gehazi fails, as she knew he would, she insists again that Elisha comes himself. That in and of itself is an interesting part of the story, because it's not, we don't always see a woman so independent in her thought and in her action, and also on such a high spiritual level. So I told you that the rabbis see her as a spiritually great woman. She um, is very, I don't know if experience is the right word. She's very willing to model hospitality, welcoming guests. She has this faith that even in crisis exemplifies what we all should have when we are faced with adversity, that the persistence in prayer that Elisha does. It says that he prayed 7 times over this dead child before he revived. That it mirrors this Torah idea that life and mercy come through God's power. Now let's look at okay, so those are the 2 stories. Let's look at the linguistic connections. The first one I want to mention is that in both the Torah portion and in the Haftarah portion, these everyday items, domestic language is going on. So in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 18, verse 6, when these guests, these 3 visitors that Abraham does not know that they are angels, when they come, what does he do? He calls to Sarah. He says, and Abraham hastened to the tent of Sarah, and he said, hasten 3 sa'ah of meal and fine flour, that's a measurement, knead and make cakes. Okay, that's a very domestic thing. Go cook our guests some food. Okay, and in the first story in the Haftarah, what does Elisha say to the woman who is the widow without resources? He says, borrow vessels from all your neighbors. Okay, so we're talking about cooking, we're talking about oil, we're talking about kitchen vessels. This is all connected to there's a Hebrew root, a Hebrew word, kli, which means a vessel, that it's a symbol of the um, receptivity that human beings have to blessing. In order for blessing to descend, it needs I'm going like this because this is my vessel. It needs to have like a physical place to land. Okay. But there is this linguistic connection between both of these stories happening in the home. That's number one. Here's another one I found. In both, there's a reference to the husband being old. So in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 18, verse 12, after Sarah is told that she's going to have a child, the verse says, and Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have become worn out, will I have smooth flesh? And also, she says, my husband is old. And then in the Haftarah, with a conversation between Elisha and his servant Gehazi, Elisha says, what can we do for her? And Gehazi says, indeed, she has no son, and her husband is old. It's an exact overlay. There's also a linguistic connection between 2 scenes that are unfolding in an entryway. In the case of the Parsha, Abraham is pictured sitting at the entrance to his tent, and which is a threshold. It's sort of a space between the private space and the public space. So the doorway is like a meeting point, okay? And in the Haftarah, in 2 Kings, Malachim Bet, chapter 4, verse 15, it says about the Isha Gedola of Shunem that she stood in the doorway. Okay, so there's this linguistic connection. Standing at the doorway in Hebrew text sometimes symbolizes a readiness for revelation of some kind. Okay, so both Abraham and the Shunammite woman are engaged in hospitality. They are both at the doorway, and they are almost like in a preparatory stage for what's going to happen next. There's also the very obvious connection of the promise of a son. Okay, they both use the expression, the Hebrew expression, that means at this time next year. So in Bereshit chapter 18, at this time next year, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And what does Elisha promise the Shunammite woman? At this season next year, you shall embrace a son. And this in Hebrew, ka'at chaya, literally at the time of life, meaning the same time next year, is a fairly rare expression in Tanakh, and it's only found in these 2 places. So it connects the story of the promise to Sarah that she's going to have a child and the promise to the Shunammite woman, not just a child, but a son. There's also, we see in both cases, skepticism of the mother in accepting the promise of a child after having waited for so long. So in Bereshit chapter 18, verse 12, it says, and Sarah laughed within herself, And this is the same verse we used before. After I become worn out, will I have smooth flesh? And also my master is old. And the Shunammite woman says, don't, my Lord, man of God, don't deceive your servant, meaning don't play with me. Don't tell me you're going to give me a child if there's any chance that that child is not going to live a good, long, and full life. Okay. So there's the skepticism of the mother, the older mother, upon hearing the news. There's also um, the blessing and the promise filled. So both verses use the Hebrew formula Asher Amar, which means as he had spoken or as he had said. So in Bereshit chapter 21, verse 1, and the Lord remembered Sarah as he had said, as she was promised that she was going to have a son. And then in Malachim Bet, in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 17, and the woman conceived and bore a son at that season as Elisha had spoken. So there's another connection. And then the last linguistic one is that there's in both cases, both Yitzchak, Isaac, who was born out of the promise to Sarah and Abraham, and the child who we are going to call Habakkuk because that's what our tradition says, they both are sort of near death or dead. There's a concept of a life, their life is threatened and then it's restored. So in the Parsha, the life of Yitzchak, the life of Isaac is threatened in that his father is about to slaughter him. And his death is like right there in the atmosphere. In Second Kings in Malachim Bet, chapter 4, verse 34, there's almost the end of the Haftarah. There's also the dead child who is revived through the actions of Elisha. Okay. Those are, I think, really strong ways of understanding the connection between the Haftarah, the Parsha, and the Haftarah. We don't always get like this is, I think, our third one. We don't always get so much overlap, but you can understand why the rabbis, when it was forbidden to read from a Torah scroll, why they picked these stories to remind people. Remember that in that time, the people who were listening to these Torah readings were very familiar with them. And so it would recall for them, they would read they would listen to the story in the Book of Kings, and it would remind them of all of the connections that they already knew. But let's look at some thematic connections. Okay. One of them is hospitality and generosity. Hospitality in our tradition opens the door to blessing when we make space for other people in our space, either physically by inviting them literally into our home, or emotionally by, some people use the expression today, holding space for someone. That is also a way of making space for the divine. And so in the Parsha, Abraham runs to welcome the three strangers and he offers them food and a place to rest and some shade and so forth. And what is the hospitality and generosity in the Haftarah? The Shunammite woman and her husband prepared this special room for Elisha. And they don't expect anything in return. They just see that he comes by a lot and he would be more comfortable if he had his own space. There's also this idea of faith is not just like something that these characters, in particular Abraham and the Shunammite, I'm sorry, now I'm speaking of the story of the widow, who they do something as expressions of their faith. So Abraham, when he is commanded to sacrifice his son, which he does not understand that command, he trusts God, that God's purpose is good, and he goes through the steps that he's supposed to go through, which is considered the most difficult of the 10 trials of Abraham, and we understand why. But also the widow in the first story, Elisha doesn't tell her the whole thing. He just says, go gather vessels. And she obeys his instructions to borrow as many empty vessels as she can find that her neighbors are willing to lend her, so she can pour out her little tiny jar of oil, which miraculously multiplies. So there's a thematic connection in, even when they didn't understand what was being told to them, either by, in the case of Abraham, by God directly, or in the case of the widow, the poor widow, by Elisha, the prophet of God, they took action. Okay. Um, there's also the theme of compassion and imitating God, in as much as it's possible for humans to do that. So, um, to be merciful, to be attentive to other people who are suffering, that is uh, a way that we can imitate God. So in the Parsha, Avraham pleads for the people of Sodom, even for the wicked ones, out of compassion for them. He doesn't want to necessarily see them all get destroyed, even though they do all get destroyed, except for his nephew and his nephew's daughters. Also, where else do we see compassion in the Haftarah? Elisha has this desperate poor widow, and he helps her in a way that preserves her dignity. He doesn't just like say, here's 100 shekels from my, I don't even know what the currency was in that time, but here's money from my pocket. He helps her in a more creative kind of way so that she has to do something um, to get herself out of this issue. But there is that parallel. There's also a parallel um, that teaches us that there is no situation that is beyond hope, that life and the renewal of life can emerge even from the darkest places. It's very poignant right now. I just finished reading the book called Hostage by Eli Sharabi. He was one of the hostages that was released after close to 500 days, I'm not sure. And he tells the story of how bleak the situation was for him and the other hostages with whom he was held, and how he eventually was able to keep himself and to keep the other hostages that he was in captivity with, focused on the goal, which was to get out of the tunnels. That would be an example of no situation beyond hope, because you can imagine that if he hadn't been there to prop up the others, some of them might have said, after 6 months, after a year, after whatever, we're never going to get out of here. There's no hope. Where do we see this idea of that no situation is beyond hope? So in the near sacrifice of Yitzhak, in the near sacrifice of Isaac, that ends with his life being spared, that is a moment of mercy. That is a moment of renewal for both Yitzhak and Abraham, for both father and son. And also, what's the moment when Elisha revives the dead son, showing that God can even restore what we think is lost. And the last um, thematic connection is, we sort of talked about this, that there's a sacredness in everyday life. Holy things don't have to happen in sacred buildings. It doesn't have to happen in a synagogue. It doesn't have to happen in a temple. It doesn't have to happen in a rabbi's office. That every act of kindness, every act of faith, every act of gratitude can turn just an ordinary space into something holy. So you are all in your, wherever you are, in your living room, in your kitchen, wherever, in your home, I'm in my office, and we are studying Torah together. And that sanctifies this space. That Abraham's tent becomes a place of divine revelation. It happened, that's where he lived. It happened in his home. The Shunammite's home became a place of godly revelation. So it's an important idea that holy things, um, or the divine energy, can come upon us anywhere that we are in the world. It's not dependent on, like I said, being in a synagogue, or being in a temple, or being in Israel, or being at the Kotel, or being in Jerusalem, or any of those things enhance it, but they're not dependent upon it. Okay, so now we've summarized the Parsha and the Haftarah. We have looked at some linguistic connections. We've looked at some thematic connections. Let's look and see what lessons can we derive from these stories. So the first one is, and there's a little bit of overlap here because we've touched on some of these themes, but let's see if we can go a little deeper. The first one is hospitality. So hospitality is it is a something that transcends religion and culture. Welcoming others um, is something that a lot of cultures do. In Judaism, we call this haknasat orchim, which means welcoming the guest. But interestingly enough, the mitzvah of haknasat orchim, the divine commandment for Jews to extend hospitality to others, really counts when you're extending hospitality to someone who maybe they wouldn't have a meal if you didn't invite them to your house, or they wouldn't have company to eat with if you didn't invite them to your house. So a lot of people on Shabbat, for example, they often will have friends over, and that's nice, but it's not. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not strictly speaking the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim. Hachnasat Orchim is really extending hospitality to people who would not otherwise have what you have to offer. Um, and so we see in the story of the Shunammite woman, and also in the story of Avraham and Sarah, but specifically in the Haftarah, that this small room that they build for Elisha that gives him comfort and honors him and so forth, without expecting anything in return, that hospitality becomes channeled through which they receive the divine blessing of a son. And actually, all of their nation receives blessing because their son is a prophet. Okay. So the generosity and sincere hospitality help create connection between people. And kindness that we do for others is an investment in human connection. It's not a transaction like you do this for me and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Even small gestures can open doors to goodness. So I'm reminded that um, when Rabbi Leo D, when his wife and his two daughters were murdered 2.5 years ago, three, I can't remember exactly. There were these magnets that went around. I'm guessing you guys didn't get them, but we have one. It sits on our fridge and it asks three questions. What did what did you do? What did somebody do for you today? What's something good that somebody did for you today? What is something that you did for another person? And what did God do for you today? So it's just like a way to stay grounded. So for you, for you to see your home potentially, certainly your heart as a place um, where you can dispense, from which you can dispense kindness. Even in our WhatsApp group, so Beth Ann has written a few times about her husband's health challenges, but other people have done that also. There have been a number of times in the years that we've been together that I've seen that somebody has asked for prayers or asked for support, and the people that respond to that are giving um, from their own generosity and so forth. So they're not necessarily saying, come over and have dinner, but they're giving in that way. So that is an important Torah value. There's also the lesson of the kind of miraculous births that take place in these two stories, and the gift of hope. So both Abraham and Sarah promised a son long after they are way past the age, demonstrating that God can defy natural limits. And also, in the same way, Elisha blesses the Shunammite woman who has no children, and she's also later in life, and also miraculously revives him when he's dead. What's the lesson? That in life, we can have unexpected renewal, that things can appear to be impossible, like by natural means, they're impossible. And all matters of faith, whether it's Jewish faith or universal faith, includes trusting the possibility that exists beyond what you might think exists, beyond what is reasonable to expect. So that idea of faith is, it doesn't seem like in the natural order such and such an outcome could be possible, but then we remind ourselves as people of faith that God can do anything. That's another universal lesson. This one, I think we kind of talked about this. I'm gonna skip that one. Sort of the idea is that faith is not just like something you feel, it's an active choice that we act with trust in God, and that opens the possibility of transformation or of renewal or whatever. So I'll tell you this, some of you may know this story, is a personal part of my personal story, part of my history. When I was 37, I was divorced. I had two little children, and I, for various reasons, I did not think I would be able to get married again. But I was in not a healthy marriage, and I knew that if I stayed in that marriage, there was zero chance that I was ever going to get married again. And so I got a divorce from the marriage that was not working, fully expecting that by all reason, for various reasons, I was maybe never, but certainly not right away, I was not going to find a husband. And God had different plans. So I was divorced in um, January of whatever this year was. In May, I met my current husband, and by December of that year, we were married. So uh, I never expected that outcome. Um, it didn't look reasonable. It didn't look possible, but God runs the world, and he can do that kind of stuff. Okay, so the encouragement to you is to think of your faith as guided by action, um, not blind belief, but trust in something that's higher, trust in the belief that God runs the world, and trust that um, things can happen and have happened, even though it doesn't look um, reasonable or it doesn't look plausible or whatever. Um, I really want to get to this. I'm going to skip some of this stuff because I see by the time I want to really get into this mystical insight. Um, and I'm just going to go directly there. Okay. I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to skip that one and talk about, okay, let's go back to the Shunammite woman and her son. And again, the Shunammite woman, she shows great hospitality to Elisha, and in return, he blesses her with a son. And then the boy dies suddenly, and Elisha revives him through prayer and physical closeness because he lays on top of him. How do we understand this on a deeper level? Okay. So in the mystical symbolism, a woman who hosts a prophet is often a mystical representation of the Shekhinah, of the feminine indwelling of the presence of God that brings something holy down into this world. So the world that we live in, the furniture that we're sitting on, maybe the pen that's in our hand, the clothes that we're wearing, all those, the food that we just ate, all those things are physical things in this kind of lower world. So her hospitality, so she represents something um, that connects the infinity of God to this lower world and brings some of that divine light down. In fact, the text talks about the room that she prepared was a little upper room. And that represents the elevation of the material world to receive this divine energy. So, a very simple way of thinking about this concept, if you can picture a Shabbat candle, which is usually just some simple white wax and a wick. In the material world, that's all it is. But they are used to usher in Shabbat. And so this is one way that Jews are instructed to elevate the material world to receive divine blessing. What's the foundational idea under this? The foundational idea under this is something called dira b'tachtonim, making a dwelling place in the lower world. That means that things that are holy are not limited to heaven, to spiritual realms. The physical world that we occupy, that we dwell in, is meant to become a place where God's presence is revealed. So um, I'll explain about. There's a text called the Tanya that says that it is through our actions, our speech, and our thoughts that are aligned with God's will that the coarse elements of the material world become vessels for divine light. So again, think of those Shabbat candles. It's just some simple white wax and a cotton wick. That is relatively simple, coarse material, but it becomes a vessel for something higher. So this idea of a dwelling place in the lower world, it first appears in the Tanya in this sentence. This is so deep, you guys. The ultimate purpose for the creation of this world is that the Holy One, blessed be He, desired to have a dwelling place in the lowest realms. That's where we are here. Adira b'tachtonim. Okay, what is the Tanya? The Tanya is one of Judaism's great spiritual works. It was written in the late 18th century by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the founder of the Chabad Lubavitch movement. And the Tanya is their foundational text. And it is sometimes um, referred to as an explanation of the soul of the Torah. So it's a guide to understanding the human soul, the purpose of creation, how to live a life of holiness in the physical world. So this idea is one of the central teachings of Chabad thought, explaining why God created the world at all. So God could very easily have spent all of eternity up in the heavens, hanging around with the angels and all these divine energy and so forth. He did not need to create a low base world, but he wanted to have a place to shine his divine light into. And so he created, so God's infinite light was originally only revealed in the higher spiritual world, but he wanted our physical world, which is very distant from this divine awareness, should become a place where God's presence is fully revealed. And how do we do that? How do humans do that? So it's something that the Jewish people in particular are especially charged with, but it's possible for anybody who is living in alignment with God's will to reflect this light. So we achieve this through Torah study, through mitzvot that transform material things into these vessels of holiness. So the phrase to dwell in the, how did I put it, to a dwelling place in the lowest realm is expressing God's will, that he wants to be revealed in the places where he is the most concealed. And this helps us understand a little bit that the Jewish mission is not to try to escape the material world, but to transform it into holiness, which is very different than, for example, some Eastern religions. So like not that I'm a big expert, but like Hinduism and Buddhism want to get their adherents, their believers, whatever, to learn how to transcend the physical world. They see the physical world as a like a burden that if you want to really connect to a higher realm, you have to mute that. Okay. But that is very different than a Torah approach, because is this true if I say every, but a lot of them, a lot of the ritual things that Jews do take something physical and try to connect it through God's will to something divine. And that's what sanctifies the physical thing and opens up a conduit, opens up a way for divine blessing to come into this lower world. So I already told you the example of lighting Shabbat candles, that it transforms the wax, or some people use oil, into a source of spiritual light, into peace. Eating with a blessing, making a blessing before you eat. It turns food, which is otherwise a sort of coarse physical material thing, to an instrument of divine service. Um, this is not relevant to you, but it's also not relevant to me. Two of the three: tefillin, mezuzah, and tzitzit. So they are physically made out of leather, parchment, and thread that elevate these kind of coarse physical materials, leather, parchment, and thread, into mitzvot. And the last example I'll give you is giving tzedakah, that transforms money, um, which is probably the most clear symbol of material attachment, into a pathway to transmit kindness, to bring God's energy into the world. You may be aware, I'm not sure if in the first year we were together, we spoke about this, but Judaism not only doesn't just teach us to give charity, but there are certain priorities in charity that we are guided by. So it's not just a question of randomly giving money to wherever, wherever. There's a system for it, that each mitzvah is like a spiritual pipeline, that God's blessing can flow into the world. So when Israel, that is when the Jewish people perform the will of God, blessing flows from above to below. And that's one of the things that we understand is one of the roles of the Jewish people. But you can have a part of that in in some of these same ritual actions, in some of these same ways of living, of understanding that the physical world is a low, dark place, excuse me, and living your life in a way that brings um, light into the world. So the Torah teaches that the physical world is not an obstacle to holiness, not like what you would learn in Buddhism or in Hinduism or whatever. It's actually the physical world is the exact place where holiness can be revealed if we do what God asks us to. So God creates this physical world because he wants his presence to dwell even in this most ordinary place that we live in, and it's our task to make this world a fitting home for that divine energy. And all of that is a deeper understanding of the story in this week's Haftarah. So we, just to conclude, and then I'll open it up for questions, but just to conclude, we looked at a review of the Parsha and a review of just the basic narrative of the Haftarah. We looked at linguistic connections. We looked at thematic connections. We looked at a few of the universal messages. And then we looked at the symbolism of this woman, the Shunammite woman, and her relationship to Elisha the prophet as being a symbol of um, the bringing God's divine light into this world. Okay, now um, let me figure out how to change my view. Okay, now I can see you guys. It's very weird. Teresa, welcome back. It's so good to see you. Um, I I don't I do this because you asked me to do it, but it's a little disorienting not to see you when I'm talking. Okay. So as we have done in the past, I am going to stop the recording here, and then what time is it? Let me just see. We have 4 minutes together.